Hello. Welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with The Bad Seed. Chapter 2. Mrs. Penmock had entered her daughter in the Fern School in the previous August, and Miss Burgess Fern, who handled enrollment, said shrewdly, "You must not get the impression that ours is a so-called progressive school. We teach the niceties, even some of the elegancies of fastidious living, but we give our pupils a solid groundwork in practical matters too. We teach our children to spell accurately, to read with fluency, and where possible with some passion as well, or with some expression as well. We teach arithmetic the way arithmetic should be taught, from a book and from a blackboard, not on a sandpile in the garden with shells and flower petals for counters." "Yes, I know," said Christine. "My husband and I talked with one of our neighbors at Florbell Apartments, a Mrs. Breedlove, and from what she's told us, we feel your school is the ideal for a child of Rhoda's temperament." Miss Claudia Fern entered at that moment and went to one of the filing cabinets as Mrs. Penmark continued in an uncertain voice, "You know Mrs. Breedlove, of course?" The sisters looked at each other as though surprised anyone could ask such a question. "Monica Breedlove?" asked Miss Burgess Fern in astonishment. "Why, everyone in town knows Monica. She's one of our most active citizens. She won the Civic Association a couple of winters ago as the most valuable citizen of the year." Miss Octavia Fern came in and sat at her desk. She said, smiling gently, "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the name Penmark. It's an unusual name, and I'm sure I'd remember it. Have you been here long?" "No, not at all. My husband is with Calendar Steamship People. We transferred here from Baltimore only a week ago or so. We hardly know anyone so far." And Christine, seeing the direction her mind was taking, said in a propitiating voice, "My husband's people are from New England. The name Penmark is better known there, I'm told." "Ours is not an inexpensive school," said Miss Burgess Fern. "Our tuition is high, which is to accord with standards we use in choosing our pupils. We reject far more than we select." Miss Octavia said, "We will find neither false pride nor snobbery here. We are sympathetic with the problems of our children, and we operate on a basis of complete non-prejudice, but we do not consider the best interests of a child are served through minimizing the standards of excellence his ancestors have established. A problem of action fashionable in some quarters during the reign of Roosevelt, and we do not believe to play what his forebears have accomplished or to belittle what they have collected in the pristine frame or worldly possessions." She waited and then said, "In other words, while we advocate the democratic ideal, we are convinced that such an ideal is possible only where all members of a particular group come from the same level of society, preferably a high one." So they want high society people, but I get the feeling but Claude Daigle, I feel is not from a high background. I mean, at least as we go on the story. So, Mrs. Penmark turned these remarkable statements over in her mind and said, "I think you'll find our family background acceptable." In a more careful voice, she added that she herself had been born in the Midwest, and as a child had lived pretty much all over the country. She had taken a degree at the University of Minnesota, graduating the summer before Pearl Harbor. her scholastic record had not been distinguished. She had not gone by reasonably well. That was about all. She hesitated, looked down at her hands, and said, "My father, to whom I was devoted, was killed in a plane crash during the Second World War. His name was Richard Bravo, and he was quite well known at one time as a colonist and war correspondent." Of course, said Miss Octavia. "Yeah, I'm familiar with his work. He has imagination, beautiful prose style." She turned to her sisters. They nodded in agreement, and she went on. "He was a man of depth and understanding. His death was a great loss. There's a book of his collected pieces in the library," said Miss Burgess, but Miss Octavia raised her hand as though the matter was settled, and though Miss Penmark had established beyond question the eligibility of her daughter, and said, "Our enrollment is limited, as you probably know, and already we have met our quota from our next term. But my sister and I will surely find a place for the little granddaughter of Richard Bravo." Then rising, she bowed and went to the next room. Miss Claudia, the youngest of the sisters, found what sought to be files and said, "So Miss Monica Breedlove is a neighbor of yours?" "At one of the carnival balls, it was the year I came out, she stepped on my train and pulled it off. I was so embarrassed I went home and didn't dare come back." "Monica was the first woman in town to bob her hair," said Miss Burgess, "and she was the first woman, at least the first respectable one, to smoke in public." "When you see her," continued Miss Claudia, "tell her I think she stepped on her train because Colonel Glass had danced with me 3 times before the evening and didn't dance with her once." Christine nodded and promised to do so, but she forgot until the morning of the picnic, when, as she approached the school, she saw Miss Claudia trailing a paper-filled burlap bag across the lawn. She smiled, remembering, and after Mrs. Breedlove had parked her car, Miss Rhoda had joined a group near the fig trees. She repeated Miss Claudia's words. At once, Mrs. Breedlove laughed. She remembered perfectly. It remembered at once of the annual fancy dress ball of the Pegasus Society, and all she'd done was put on the toe of her dancing slipper on poor, frowsy Claudia's train, and exert just the tiniest bit of pressure as Miss Claudia giggled and walked away on the arm of Colonel Glass, and as she suspected, the train detached itself and pulled away. Put something out of the old Marx Brothers movie. The trouble was the Fern girls, in those days at least, were so hard up for ready cash that their wardrobe was a joint one. A sort of grab bag which felt free to use when occasion demanded it. And so they were always arranging and rearranging the parts of their wardrobe in a different pattern, in different colored contrasts, hoping to achieve somehow the illusion of freshness, but somehow was able for the one occasion. Nothing was sewn together as the clothes of others were sewed. Instead, everything was tied and pinned and basted hurriedly, and so that it could take up a part the next day and used again. Miss Breedlove laughed gaily and fanned herself for a moment in silence, and then she went away to say that Claudia had been quite correct in suspecting her motive. She had done it on purpose, all right, but not because Claudia had danced 3 times with Colonel Glass, whom she remembered as a pompous and most tiresome man, interested in fishing and the regenerative power of discipline impersonally applied, but because Claudia was making such a play for her brother Emery that she determined no matter what happened to the Wages family, there wasn't going to be any disarranged cow like Claudia Fern in it. The 2 buses were drawn up to the curb, and already some of the children had taken their places. Mrs. Breedlove, looking around her, called to Rhoda, and when the child joined her, she said, "Where's that little Daigle boy, the one who won the penmanship medal? Has he arrived? I haven't seen him." "There he is," said Rhoda, "standing at the gate." The boy was pale and remarkably thin, with a long wedge-shaped face, and a pink full underlip puckered with inappropriate sensuousness. His mother stood possessively beside him, an intense woman with protruding eyes. She plucked anxiously at her passive son, adjusting her cap, smoothing his tie, fiddling with his socks, or dabbling in his face with a handkerchief. He was wearing the penmanship medal pinned to the pocket of his shirt, and his mother, just knowing somehow the medal was being discussed, put her arm nervously around his shoulders and lifted the medal in her palm as though it were she and not her son who had won it. Okay, so I know we got Dad the penmanship medal at the picnic, so, the plot gets going. But I don't know why you would wear it there in the first place. It could get, lost or stolen or whatever. But, gotta have a plot, I guess. Mrs. Breedlove said to Rhoda in an amused, coaxing voice, "Don't you think it would be a lovely gesture if you went over and offered your congratulations? You told him that since you didn't win the medal, you're most happy that he did." She took the child's hand as if to guide him to the gate. But Rhoda pulled back and said, "No, no." She shook her head with determination and said, "I'm not glad he won it. It was mine. The medal was mine, but he got it." Mrs. Breedlove was startled at the cold intensity of the child's voice, but she laughed after a moment and said, "Oh, I wish my instincts were natural as yours, my dear." She turned as though for verification to Christine and said gaily, "A child's mind is so wonderfully innocent, so lacking in guile or deceit." But Mrs. Penmark had already moved away to speak to Miss Octavia Fern, who nodded and beckoned to her. They stood beside the small porch near the star bushes and Miss Octavia said, "My sisters and I were so disappointed that Mr. Penmark didn't come with you today. We've never met him, although we've been anxious to do so since we heard so many pleasant things about him. Everyone says he's such a capable young man. Actually, we hoped to see him yesterday at the closing exercises, but I suppose he was too busy to get away." Christine explained that at the period of his career, her husband's work kept him away from home much of the time. Currently, he was in South America to make a survey of the port facilities along the west coast. He'd embarked only the week before. The only news of him she had so far was that he'd be gone all summer. The only news she had of him thus far was capable of announcing his arrival. She missed him, of course, but she resigned herself to the inevitable fact that this time he'd be gone all summer. Had it been possible, he certainly would have had come to the closing exercises the day before, as in turn had much heard about Miss Fern, and often expressed a wish to know them personally. They seated themselves in rockers on the porch, and after a time, Miss Octavia longed to the unmasked questions of parents and said, "Are you interested in what we think of Rhoda and what she's accomplished since she's been with us?" Mrs. Penmark said that she was, adding that the child, almost from babyhood, had been something of a riddle both her and herself had been to her and her husband. It was a difficult thing to isolate or identify, but there was a strange mature quality in the child's character that they both found disturbing. Both she and her husband had thought that a school like their own, a school whose accent fell on discipline and old-fashioned virtues, would be the ideal school for Rhoda. Would eliminate, or at least modify, some of the upsetting factors of her temperament. Miss Fern nodded to a new arrival, pressed one hand against her forehead as though marshalling her thoughts, and said that in some ways Rhoda was one of those satisfactory pupils the school ever had. She had never been absent a single day. She had never once been tardy. She was the only child in the history of the school who made 100 in deportment each month in the classroom and 100 of self-reliance and conservation each month on the playgrounds for a full school year. And if Mrs. Pepper had dealt with as many children as Miss Fern had in her long career as a school teacher, she realized what a remarkable record that was. She put her tattered straw hat and adjusted over her eyes as protection against the strong morning and what was now sifting itself insistently through the lifting leaves of the camphor tree. Rhoda is a conservative, thrifty child, she went on, and perhaps the neatest little girl I've ever encountered. Christine laughed and said, Rhoda certainly is neat. My husband and I don't know, says he doesn't know where she gets her tithing. It's certainly not from either of us. Miss Burgessford came up and sat up in the chair beside her sister, and after listening for a moment, she said, I think the secret of Rhoda's temperament is the simple fact that she doesn't need others the way most of us do. She's such a self-efficient little girl. Never in all my life I've seen anybody so completely all of one piece. Mrs. Penmark sighed, raised her hands up with humorous exaggeration, and said, Sometimes I wish she was more dependent on others. Sometimes I wish she were the less practical and more affectionate. Miss Octavia, from the depth of her experience with children, spoke gently. You will not be able to change her. The child lives in her own particular world, and I'm sure it isn't anything at all like the world you and I live in. Miss Burgess said, The little girl, even at 8, seems to stand alone, and there is not common at any age. She got up, walked up, but paused to add, Rhoda has many qualities remarkable in a child. In the first place, her courage is most unusual. She seemed almost without physical fear. She'll stand up calmly to things the frightened the average child could make and cry or run away. And she's certainly no tattletale, that we've already found out. Last winter, one of our boys threw a stone through Mrs. Nixon's window across the street, and you'd have thought a hydrogen bomb had been released on us from the commotion Adelaide Nixon made, said Mrs. Octavia gently. Anyway, continued Miss Burgess, Rhoda saw the whole thing, and of course she knew who the guilty boy was. But when she questioned her, telling her it was her duty as an honorable little citizen to report the culprit, we got precisely nowhere. She just went on eating her apple, shaking her head, and looking us with cold, calculating, almost contemptuous looks she had at certain times. Oh, I know, said Christine. I've seen that look so many times. We never found out the truth, said Mrs. Burgess. If the little boy hadn't broken down in tears next day and confessed his crime. At that point, Miss Octavia, as head of the school, took up the story and said, At first, my sisters and I thought Rhoda should be punished for willfulness and lack of cooperation, but we came to the conclusion that her attitude was really a demonstration of loyalty, that she would not be given a demerit, which would spoil her perfect record, for refusing to be a little sneak. Christine put her hand on Miss Octavia's forearm. Is she popular? She asked. Do others like her? But before Miss Octavia could reply, before she was faced with the choice of telling an untruth or admitting that the other pupils both feared and detested Rhoda, her sister Claudia, on watch at the sidewalk, called out the last of the children had come and had been checked off the roster. The buses were now ready to start, and the picnic began. And Miss Fern and her sisters, their arms loaded with the last-minute things which somebody might, after all, find a use for, walked with Mrs. Penmark down the long flag paved to the gate. For a long time, there was milling about, laughter, and awkward movement, and then at length, the Fern sisters, their assistants, and their pupils were all stowed away, and the last bus pulled out from the curb, and the driver turned his head, listening and turning his head with a quick movement of suspicious bird. The lead bus had been parked in the driveway beneath the low-hanging limbs of the camphor tree, and as the driver moved his bus forward, it scraped the tree branches of the tree, causing a rain of fluttering aromatic leaves to fall on the pavement below. At first movement of the lead bus, the first note of departure, two Airedales who had lain contentedly with muzzles resting on their outstretched paws, sprang from the lawn of the house across the street and barked hysterically, springing into the air, frenziedly whirling, running around the fence. The cap of one of the little boys rolled on the street, and the character bus stopped while Monica Breedlove, flushed and laughing, ran forward and restored the cap to its owner. A little girl in the following bus dropped her slate, which, for reasons of her own, she thought appropriate to bring along on the picnic out of a window, and the driver of that bus, to the accompaniment of shouts, catcalls, and piercing finger whistles, stopped at the bus, went back, and retrieved it. In the interval, Mrs. Daigle rushed to the bus for a final clutch of her son. She caressed the damp, unresisting hand that he held out together and said, "Has your headache gone? Have you gotten your handkerchief?" The driver returning to the slate, an exaggeration. Watch that window, lady. You must not overexert yourself, said Mrs. Daigle in a tense voice, and keep out of the sun as much as you can. Slowly, the buses moved forward again, and many people came to their doors to smile and call out the travelers, and then the drivers turned to the corner, but cautiously remembered Mrs. Octavia's repeated admonitions, and the street was calm once more. The picnic had begun in earnest. It was then that Rhoda moved from her seat and took possession of one near the little Daigle boy. His eyes were fixed steadily on the penmanship medal, but she did not speak at all. And then, a moment later, where she felt more sure of herself, where she stood in the aisle beside the boy, stretched out her hand and touched the medal, but Claude pulled away petulantly and said, "Why don't you go someplace else? Why don't you leave me alone?" As the buses disappeared, Mrs. Penmark moved in the direction of Mrs. Breedlove's automobile. She turned her head to look for a friend and saw that Monica was, as usual, the center of a group of people. Old acquaintances, plainly, who she had not seen in a long time, and as usual, she was talking with animation, moving her head and her shoulders, tossing her neck wildly for emphasis. When she saw this, Mrs. Penmark moved to the strip of the lawn that was between the sidewalk and the street. Wait until her friend had finished her story. Two men came up and stood under the crepe myrtle tree behind her, both looking at their watches at the same instant. "I was reading the other day," said the taller of the two, that we live in an age of anxiety. You know what? I thought that was pretty good. A fair judgment. I told Ruth about it when I got home, and she said, "You can say that again." "Every age that the people lived in the age of anxiety," said the older man. "If anyone asked me, I'd say the age we live is an age of violence. It looks to me like the violence is in everybody's mind these days. It looks like you're just sitting to keep on and there's nothing left to ruin. If you stop and think about it, it scares you. Well, maybe we live in an age of anxiety and violence. Now that sounds more like it, come to think about it. I guess that's what our age is really like. They shook hands, made a date for lunch the following week, and walking toward their beckoning wives while Mrs. Penmark stood quietly, turned the age over to mind she had heard. It seemed to her that suddenly that the violence was an inescapable factor of the violence, perhaps the most important factor of all, to eradicable thing that they lay like a bad seed behind kindness, behind compassion, behind the embrace of love itself. Sometimes it lay hidden, sometimes it lay close to the surface, but it was always there, ready to appear under the right conditions and its irrational dreadfulness. Mrs. Breedlove came up to her a little later and joined Christine on the grass, and then moving majestically toward her parked car, she said, "The incident of Claudia's Fern's lost train is loaded with symbolism, so I'm not surprised she remembered it all these years and spoke of it to you." When in analysis, Claudia's train came up again and again. In fact, it became one of the key situations in my anxiety neurosis. She tossed her head, waved vaguely to passers-by, and went on. "My incestuous fixation on poor Emery is so obvious that it doesn't need elaboration, so I won't say anything incest being so trite. What was more interested in the eyes of my analyst was that the detachment of the train revealed latent penis hostility and penis envy, and it showed beside my impulse to mar and castrate and Wimbo. She talked with animation, nodding for her head for emphasis. There was so much like to sleep, but she knew how circumspect one must be in discussing, even with the completest scientific detachment, even those as though objective and intelligent as Christine had proved herself to be. These emotion-charged matters, these primitive taboos to the half-civilized tribe, if one were not to be considered depraved, or at least a bit on the peculiar side, but just the same, there were so many questions, many implications, some of them quite amusing in the temple, seemingly ruptured of poor Claudia's train, but she restrained herself. She buttoned up her big lip and omit these other things, although they were plain enough, heaven knew, to the unbiased and perceptive listener. But Christine heard little that she said, for her mind was still concerned with the conversation she had listened to, still fixed on the fixed theme of violence. Her father, whom she loved so deeply, had himself died in the uncaring violence of others. And remember again, she thought, he was too young. There should have been many more years before him. Had it not happened, he might be alive today to comfort me when he did when I was a child and frightened. She remembered the last time she had seen him. It was a week before the plane had carried him, had brought him down by enemy fire somewhere in the South Pacific. She had gone alone to the airport with him, her mother being ill at the time, where he was to embark on the initial leg of what was to be his final journey. And while she was seeing about his luggage and not necessarily task, which was insist on being before him, he put his arms around her and held her cheek tightly, being his own. It seemed like now that must have been some recognition of his own end, and some acknowledgement that that was the journey from which he would never return, from which he had kissed her and sent her safely in her ear. You were the bright thing in my life. You were the thing I loved more than all the others. I want you to remember that, no matter what happens. I want you to remember that always and never change from what you are at this moment. Remembering now, Christine turned her head away so that Monica's discerning eye could not see her emotion and said under her breath, I remember, Father, I remember. Mrs. Breedlove parked her car under the live oak and raised her eyes. She caught the sight of Leroy polishing the brass at the back of her house. She made a rueful gesture with her lips and said, I'm sorry I made such an issue about the hose, but Leroy can try the patience of a saint. I remember that he wasn't had our opportunities or advantages, and that he had no right to expect too much from him, but of course, I go on losing my temper and forgetting my fine sentiments. Hearing Mrs. Breedlove's voice, Leroy looked up and caught her eye. She nodded and waved gaily to him to look that their misunderstanding was a thing of the past, that she no longer cherished hard feelings, no bore him malice, that she found him in herself to pardon his rude behavior. But Leroy was not to be placated so easily now that victory had so plainly been his. He did not return the greeting. He only stared at her, shrugging his shoulders, and disappeared around the side of the building in the direction of the courtyard where the new garages, once the old carriage houses, were. He resisted the building and spat on the cement, his mouth twisting with sourness of his discontent. That know-it-all, that Monica Breedlove, that loudmouth bitch. She didn't think nobody knew anything but her. Going around insulting people, going around to people as good as she was, and thinking she knew it all. Well, he'd shown her a thing or two one of these days. He'd show that bitch plenty, and plenty good. It wouldn't be surprised him if she turned out one of those lady lovers you read about these days. His mind flooded with the obscenities his lips shaped under his breath, that he walked away, his eyes darting from side to side, his hands making little slashing gestures against the air. He heard the door of Mrs. Breedlove's car, and the two women came up to walk, chatting together. He stood concealed behind the Japana bush, peering at him through leaves. Now that dizzy blonde, that trough-fed Christine Penmark was something else. He'd like to get her down in the basement someday. He'd let her have it all right. He turned her every way but loose. He put it in all her way there were in the book, and he'd come up with some extra ways besides. He'd make her holler calf rope, and when he'd got done with her, she'd follow him like a begging bitch. He'd make her cry and beg for him again, and that's what. Sometimes he'd give it to her, and sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes, depending how he felt. Mrs. Breedlove on the door glanced at her watch and cried out, Heaven and